Hi, today I'm going to show 3 games I played with my Starbucks sparring partner, who's probably the only person who will watch this video. All 3 start with an opening called the Italian game, and were played one right after the other. She wanted to keep trying until she won a game. These are all odds games where I got 2 minutes for my side and she got 30 minutes for her side, and we had a delay of 5 seconds because I was writing down moves on paper. So here we go. Game 1. White opens e4, gaining space in the center, opening lines for the queen and the light square bishop. Black does the same thing. White plays knight f3, developing the knight. You always want to get your pieces out early, especially your knights and bishops. And I'm attacking the pawn on e5. Black also wants to develop a piece and defend the pawn, so black plays knight c6. And then white plays bishop c4, and this is the beginning of the Italian game. Here I'm developing the bishop. I'm attacking the initially weak f7 pawn. This is an attack and not a threat. Important distinction. And it's an attack because the pawn is currently adequately defended. If the pawn was not adequately defended, it would also be a threat. That f7 pawn is often a target early in the game before either side is castled or before the black side is castled. Sometimes white's f2 pawn can also be a target, the same way. So black played bishop c5, which is the most common response, developing the bishop and attacking f2. Remember I said f2 can also be weak sometimes. Now, in the Italian game, a lot of times white wants to play d4. So the question is, can white play that now? Is it safe to play? So pause the video and see if it's safe for white to play d4. And if not, why not? Okay, white could try to play d4, but unfortunately for white, the d4 square is attacked 3 times by black, and it's only defended, well, twice after that pawn push. It would be defended by the knight and by the queen, but nothing else. So it's not safe to play. However, white still wants to play it, so white plays c3, preparing to play d4. Now if white gets to play d4, it'll be defended 3 times because of that extra pawn there. So black played knight f6, threatening the e4 pawn. I had suggested to my opponent that she try to develop her pieces before moving a pawn in general. So that's why she played knight f6 instead of, let's say, d6 to defend the pawn more when it doesn't really need it yet, the e5 pawn. Okay, so white continued with d4, which was the plan, right? That's why white played c3 before. And this move threatens both the bishop and black's e-pawn. Now white is following a well-known plan to open up the center and get a big attack against black's king. Now I pointed out to my opponent that I was even leaving the e4 pawn unprotected, and that it might be taken later, but I might let that happen so that I could get, a big attack and kind of gain some time to get that attack. Now the question is, I've just attacked those 2 pieces, right? The bishop on c5 and the pawn on e5. How should black respond? So let's pause the video here and see how should black respond. Okay, what black did in the game was black saved her bishop by playing bishop e7. Now, that saves the bishop, but the bishop's moving backwards. It's a little bit passive, but more importantly, it gives up the e-pawn. So what black could have done instead was gone ahead and taken the attacking pawn. Now it's just a pawn trade, and the bishop can get away, and in fact can check black's king, or check white's king. And after knight c3, black would even be winning a pawn with knight takes e4, because white's knight is pinned. White could castle, and this leads to a really complicated game where, white didn't just mess up, white gave up that pawn on purpose. And white, this leads to a complicated game where white's knowledge and experience would probably be a big advantage. White has nice open lines for his pieces. You can see all the places white's pieces could go, all kind of piling up to attack, black's initially weak f7 pawn, attack black's king, maybe even queen. So this would be pretty scary. Now, if black knows what she's doing, black is just fine here, and maybe even a little bit better. But, this is a really hard position for black to play sometimes. Still, this is kind of standard moves. But black didn't go into that. Black moved the bishop to e7. And so white takes the inadequately defended, right, it's only defended once, the e5 pawn. It's defended by that knight, but it's also attacked by both my pawn and knight, so I can take it. Now, white's e4 pawn is still not guarded, though. So what should black play here? Okay, so black took the pawn. So black regains the pawn, but this move was really not safe. So let's see what white should play here. See if you can find the winning move for white, and pause the video. Okay, so hint, if you haven't found it yet, it's a fork. So think about that hint and pause again and see if you can find the winning move for white. So what black didn't see is that white could play queen d5, forking the knight and the f7 pawn. And if white were to take that f7 pawn right now, that would be checkmate. So that's a pretty big threat. Now, black could have played knight g4 instead of knight takes e4, but after queen d5 and then castling and then maybe h3 chasing that knight and the knight going back to h6, white would be pretty good here. White would have a fairly large advantage with better placed pieces and an extra pawn. You notice white has central control and black's knight is on the rim. White might even decide to trade his bishop for that knight and open up black's castle position. And this wouldn't be great, but it's a lot better than what happens in the game where white gets this fork. Black tries to defend against both threats. She moves the knight, and she protects f7. So that's a good idea. So you can see the knight's gotten away, and the f7 pawn is now protected twice. It's attacked twice and protected twice, so that should be enough. But white has a winning move now, so pause and see if you can find white's winning move. Okay, so the knight is now defending f7, so what white does is white removes that defender, right? Now the knight's not defending f7 anymore. And if black doesn't want to get checkmated, black needs to castle. She'll be down a piece, right? She just lost that knight, but it's better than getting checkmated. What black did, though, is she took the knight back, so now she's not down a piece, but she got checkmated. So that was the end of the first game. After that game, my opponent wanted to play again. And instead of playing white in the next game, she wanted to play black again. So we tried it again. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, playing the Italian game, attacking the pawn, and bishop c5, which is the most usual response, c3, because I want to play d4. And now, instead of knight to f6, my opponent decided to try d6. Now, she's really overprotected that e5 pawn. It's protected twice, even though I was only attacking it once. And she's opened up a diagonal for her light square bishop, which is good. So since there were no particular threats for white to worry about right now, white went ahead and castled. My opponent played bishop g4, pinning white's knight. And now white's plan has been to play d4. That's why white played c3. So white went ahead and played d4. Now remember, this is a time odds game. White wasn't, spending a lot of time thinking about these moves. White went ahead with his plan. But was it wise? So let's pause the video and find black's best reply now. Okay. Well, unfortunately for white, that pawn is not adequately guarded. Because black has that pin on the knight on f3, black can simply take the pawn. She didn't do this, but she could have. After recapture and knight takes, white can't take the pawn with the queen, can't take the knight with the queen, because obviously it's guarded by a bishop, and white can't take the knight with the other knight, which is what white would have wanted to do, because that knight is pinned, and white would lose the queen to the other bishop. So white would be down a pawn, and black would be in good shape. But that did not happen in the game. So let's go back. Now, what black did do is take on f3, and kind of the theme for this video, if you haven't noticed, is sort of what's my opponent's threat and is the move I'm making safe? So the question is, was this trade that black just decided to make, taking the knight, was it safe? So pause and decide whether or not it was safe. Try and think about what's going to happen after white takes that bishop. Okay, so unfortunately, the black's dark square bishop is still hanging, and white is going to have an added threat of checkmate after the recapture. So this should have been considered unsafe because of the mate threat and the existing threat against c5. So let's look at those. So that pawn takes bishop threat was already there when black decided to trade on f3. And now black drew white's queen to a square where it's threatening checkmate. And so that's a pretty big threat. So black saved her bishop, but she ignored the mate threat, and so she got checkmated. So that was the end of the second game. So now we're going to look at the third game, the game that didn't get recorded the first time I tried to record this video because I messed up my windows and my screen recorder. So now we're finally going to get to watch Game 3. So Game 3 starts with the Italian game again. Here we are in the Italian game, and this time my opponent decided to try something completely different. She played queen to e7. Now this is developing the queen a little bit early, but it is protecting f7, right? Now f7 was the place where I won with checkmate in the previous two games, so she's going to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, the disadvantages of this move are that it blocks in the dark square bishop, and it takes up time that would be better used developing, a knight or a bishop, objectively speaking. Now, from a practical standpoint, it's kind of reasonable because Black's just lost 2 games because of checkmate on f7, so she doesn't want that to happen again. The queen provides additional protection for f7 and also e5. And Black's much more experienced opponent can no longer rely on his memorized responses to the usual moves, which is a pretty big deal in an odds game. So now, he's only got 2 minutes, that would be me, and White has to think for himself now from here on out. So White decides to castle. There's no immediate threats to deal with, so why not get the king safe? Black plays d6, opening a path for the light square bishop, which is good. The dark square bishop now has both a queen and a pawn in its way, which is not great, but maybe it'll find somewhere else to go. So White plays d4. So with Black's king still uncastled, and White having a slight development lead if you don't count Black's queen, who probably shouldn't be on that square anyway. White decides now's the time to open up the center and see if he can get an attack going. So Black played knight b4. Now Black was going to play bishop e6, but I said, hey, that's going to be unsafe. And my opponent had to figure out why. So why is this unsafe? Let's pause the video and see if we can figure that out. Why is bishop e6 unsafe? So at Starbucks, my opponent did figure it out. White can play d5, and that's forking the knight and the bishop. Let's say Black plays knight a5, trying to cleverly get out of the fork, right? Okay, White's still attacking that bishop, but Black's also attacking a bishop, right? White could play bishop e2, and after bishop d7, White has a move that is kind of hard to see, but a really good move here. Pause the video and see if you can find White's winning move. Okay, so if you haven't seen it, I'll give you another hint. Notice that the knight on a5 is undefended, but even more importantly, the knight on a5 doesn't really have any squares that it can go to. So how could White take advantage of that? Pause the video and see if you can find it. Okay, so hopefully with that hint you could find b4. And Black has nowhere to put that knight that it can survive. And even if Black guards it, it's going to be taken with a pawn. And so Black is going to lose at least a piece for a pawn. So Black didn't play into that, though. Instead, from this position, instead of playing bishop e6, Black played knight b4. Now, I'm not really sure what the idea was here. If it's to attack the c2 pawn after some future White queen move, that seems kind of like wishful thinking. Also, it doesn't take into account how easy it is for White to chase away the knight. And whenever you're considering, putting a knight in kind of enemy territory like this, you always want to see, can your opponent chase it away? If you can, like how easy is that going to be? Especially if your opponent can chase the knight away with pawns. Maybe the knight doesn't belong out there. That's important to consider. If your opponent can't chase it away with pawns, it might be a good place. But in this case, I can, and that's what I do. So I play c3. I'm chasing the knight away. I'm strengthening my d4 pawn. I gain 2 tempi, which means, 2 moves time-wise, and black has effectively wasted those 2 moves by moving the knight and moving it right back. So 2 moves later, right, the knight is exactly where it started. So white starts to open up the center with d takes e5. Black could have taken this pawn back, but instead played bishop e6, developing the bishop, kind of challenging white's bishop, right? It's an attack, a threat against white's bishop, and further getting rid of any threat on the f pawn, right? So black's f7 pawn is really well guarded now, and all of that's good. And black said that she was hoping to later take on c4 and attack the rook on f1. Seems a little bit optimistic. White would have to be allowing a lot of things to happen for that to all go as she had planned. But it's not a bad idea. But by choosing not to recapture the pawn, black's allowing white to gain some material. So that's not good. So before capturing the pawn, of course, white needs to deal with the threat on the bishop, which white does by trading bishops. Now, black didn't want to move the f pawn, so she recaptured with the queen. And while it's often not a good idea to move the f pawn early, black should at least consider it here for a couple of reasons. First, she will probably be castling queenside very soon, so the f7 weakness will no longer be a big issue. Also, the pawn would capture towards the center. It's always good to increase central control. Now, a more advanced consideration is that the pawn's likely to become isolated after pawns are traded on d7, and black would have more pawn islands, which means groups of connected pawns, so which is not a good thing. So probably capturing of the queen was actually the best move, but you want to think, which piece should I recapture with? And it's good to kind of think of these things. So white trades off the doubled pawns, cashes in on the opportunity to, win that pawn for good, or at least for now, because black never recaptured on e5. Now white had the chance to go up a pawn. Black plays bishop to d6, bishop takes d6, recapturing, and the bishop is finally developing on move 9, right after the black queen got out of the way, and the pawn was taken on d6. Now finally the bishop got out. Now, white played b4, wanting to drive the knight on c6 away as part of a plan to push the e-pawn. And this might not have been a great idea. White's also kind of suspects that black is going to castle queenside, so that pawn might become, part of a pawn storm attack on the queen side. Now, white still hasn't guarded the e-pawn. So one thing black has to consider is it safe for black to take the e-pawn with her queen? Right? She can just play queen takes e4 and get her pawn back. So is that safe? Pause the video and decide. So at first black thought that she could take that, but when asked to look and see if it was safe at Starbucks, she figured out that it was not. If queen takes, what happens? Skewer. Rook e1, and because black's queen and king are lined up, and you always kind of want to look for the queen and the king being lined up on a file like that, the queen here is lost. Queen takes e1, queen takes e1, and black won a queen for, or white won a queen for a rook, which is pretty good. So my opponent didn't fall for that. Instead, she castled, which improves her king safety and gets black's king off that line with the queen, which is good for preventing the skewer, and getting the rook on the line with white's queen, which is good for future things. So let's take a look at this. If it was black to play here, now it's not, it's white's turn, but if it was black's turn, she could win material. So how could black play to win material if it was her turn? So pause and see if you can find black's very good move. So the move would be bishop takes h2. It's a check, so white has to deal with that. It's also a discovered attack against white's queen. And after king h2, rook d1, rook takes d1, black has won a queen and a pawn for a rook and a knight. And a queen and a pawn is more valuable than a rook and a knight. So black would be doing well here. Also notice, white's king is a little less safe. Black could go ahead and develop the knight on g8 to f6, and black would be in pretty good shape. Now, of course, it wasn't black's turn, and white wasn't going to allow that. So white has to get the queen off of that file, which white does by playing queen a4. Kind of thinking about attacking the castled king position of black's, right? A kind of shallow threat is, white might be thinking if I play b5, I can drive away the knight, and then I can take a7 with my queen now that the knight has moved. Now, black decides to start making some threats of her own. Now, she could have just taken queen takes e4 now and won a pawn, and that would also pin white's b pawn, which would make it harder for white to carry out white's plan of pushing the b pawn. But that's not what black did. Black instead played knight e5, which might not be quite as good, but is starting to make some threats, right? Black is threatening to take the knight on f3, and okay, it's guarded, but that would open up white's kingside castle position right after pawn takes f3 in response. And white didn't really want to see that. So let's say white were to play, for instance, queen takes a7, knight takes f3, g takes f3. It looks at least like white's king might be in a little bit of trouble. Now, black's king isn't really safe either, so it's kind of unclear, but white didn't want to take a chance on this. So white instead played knight takes e5. As it turns out, knight takes d4 was probably better, but that's not what white played. So knight takes e5, and white is trading in order to avoid, he was going to trade knights anyway, but he wants to trade here so that he doesn't open up his king side. Black plays queen takes e5, threatening checkmate, and I think she probably saw this position when she played knight takes e5. It was probably what she was thinking. White played f4, stopping the checkmate. Now, before trading knights, white verified that this was safe. Notice how the c3 pawn is guarded, and even though e4 can be taken, a7 is not guarded. So, white figured we're just going to be trading pawns, and the queen will be kind of going after black's king. So black did in fact finally take the e4 pawn, and white did take the a7 pawn. Now white's last couple moves, probably not great, not the best moves for sure. So white's going after black's king, but it's not a super strong threat. And now 14 moves into the game, black finally develops that last knight. Now, 14 moves in to develop that knight, that would be pretty sad, except for one fact, which is that white still hasn't developed either his queenside knight or bishop. So white's kind of behind in development. And white was searching for a solution to this while his clock was ticking down and spent too much time, and trying to move at the very last second, white played rook d1, and when he played rook d1, his flag fell and white lost the game. So black finally, on the third try, had won the game. Now, she was a little bit grumpy because she didn't want to win with the clock. She wanted to win by, having a better position and getting checkmate on the board. Now, in a time odds game, winning on the clock is still a win. She played well enough to make me think and use up all my time, so that was good. However, not only did I lose on time, but in fact, black is completely winning in this position. So there's a tactic here. You can look, white's rook is undefended, and black has a tactical way to take advantage of that. So try to find black's winning move now. I'll give you the hint that it's a double attack, and pause the video and try to find black's winning move. Okay, one more hint if you haven't found it yet. This is a double attack, and it's a discovered attack on that rook that's undefended on d1. Of course, just any discovered attack of that rook, and white will probably trade rooks, so there's more to it than that. So try to find black's move. Pause the video. Okay, so hopefully you see that bishop to c5 is the winning move. Now, in fact, black's position was so good that even if she didn't find it, and she played something like c6, and maybe white, moved the rook back to f1, black could chase away the queen. White's lack of development, right, that bishop and knight that are still sitting on their home squares, give black enough of an advantage that black is actually still, really winning even here, even if she didn't find the double attack. But with the double attack, white has no way to save the rook. So white can take the bishop, black takes the rook, and black just won an exchange, which is a rook for bishop. That's good. But more importantly, now black is hunting white's king, right? White's king has no safety. The rook is there attacking it. The queen is close by. Black's knight is ready to get into the action. So black's in pretty good shape. White plays king f2. Black can just keep checking. Queen e1. White might play king f3. And black can check again. Now, white can start trying to get another defender in, get that bishop to e3. But even without calculating anything, we can tell black is obviously winning. Her attackers outnumber white's defenders because white waited so long to develop his pieces. And white's king has been flushed out. And she's even up material because she got that rook for the bishop. So she's doing great. So here, what is black's best move to continue, what is black's best move to continue attacking white's king? Pause the video and try and find black's best move to continue attacking white's king. Okay, hint. It's actually mate in 4, and every move is a check. So if you haven't found it yet, go ahead and pause and try and see a check that you can follow by a few more checks and checkmate. Okay, so some moves that are not the best move. Rook e8 is not bad. Hitting that bishop again, now 3 pieces attacking it, only 2 defending it. After, maybe queen f5 and, rook d7. Black is definitely still winning, but it's more difficult, right? Because you let white get that check in and, try to counterattack a little bit. Let's back up. Black could play knight to d5 is pretty reasonable, getting the knight involved. This blocks white's access to f5, so white can't go and check black's king. This is probably winning, but not the fastest win. One more chance if you want to try and find it. Okay, so the best move is queen d1. And then after king g3, there are a couple of ways to check, but only one of them is made in 3. So let's see if you can find it. Go ahead and pause. Okay, so the winning check here is queen g4, and the only move white has is king f2. Now, it's made in 2. See if you can find the winning move. Pause the video. Okay, if you haven't found it, remember, it's a check. We said that each one of these moves was going to be a check. And another hint, you want to drive the king back to the first rank and checkmate with the rook afterwards. So see if you can find black's check that's going to drive the king back, and then you can finish it off with the rook. Okay, so knight e4, getting another piece involved is the way to go. Even if mate wasn't coming, this forks white's king and queen, so even if this wasn't going to be checkmate, white was going to be down a whole lot of material. And in fact, white doesn't have anything better than king f1 going back to the first rank, right? The queen and the knight are keeping the king from coming forward again. And finally, black can play rook d1, checkmate, and that's the end of the game. So black won this game on time, but she was completely winning, and now she knows. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will make more of them. Bye-bye.